All right, we are live everywhere. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So we are live here on our webinar platform and also on our SME Banking TV. And for the ones who are watching us on our YouTube channel right now, I invite you to register by the link that you see in the video description if you would like to participate actively in today's webinar and ask question to our speaker. So welcome. Today, my name is Olena Gryniuk. I'm CEE Director at the SME Banking Club, and I will be your host today. And today we discuss e-invoicing and factoring. So I think that all of you knows that during the next 2-3 years, e-invoicing is becoming mandatory in the biggest number of the European Union countries and actually other countries outside the European Union as well. So let's discuss today what it means for the factoring industry and how to take advantage from that. And my guest today is Katalin Kauzli, co-founder and business development director at Partner Hub, the provider of the e-invoicing solution. Welcome, Katalin.
Yeah, hello everyone. Very nice to have you here this afternoon. So I can start the presentation, right, Olena, or do you want to
Just a
say
second.
something?
Let
Yes.
us mention that we plan our webinar for 40-45 minutes. We are recording it, so right after we finish, you will receive the link to the video and the presentation itself. And yes, we start from the presentation, and after that, we will have time for questions and answers. So please type your questions in the chat, and we will be able to answer them. And yes, Katalin, let's go to our topic and let's discuss what is changing with the invoicing becoming mandatory and the availability of structured invoice data. You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. So hello again, everyone. Today we will be talking about how digital invoice data accelerates or can accelerate the factoring process. And then I would like to start with the fact that invoice data, we think invoice data is gold, and invoice data can be used in multiple ways in banking and in financial services. And that's why we keep talking about these topics. And this is also relevant so invoice data is also relevant for factoring as well. And we consider or we think that invoice data helps tackle the current lender side issues. I put a couple of lender issues here. If you have other issues, then please just type it into the chat, because we would like to make the webinar a little bit more interactive and livelier. So what are the issues that currently lenders can face? These are obviously the manual processes when you have to access and process data separately from various sources, not in structured formats, and so on, and so on. And this is connected to the point that lenders also would like to or would want to improve their services and their competitiveness. What can be also an issue is how to avoid invoice fraud and how to investigate invoices properly to prevent financing for fake invoices. And again, it's another issue, but how to avoid double financing. If you have other issues, please just type it into the chat and let us know. And I would like to ask or start with a personal experience. Partner Hub is an SME itself, and we also considered many times starting doing factoring. And the thing was that stopped us from the actually doing factoring with a financial service provider or a bank is that we always, woke up late. So when we needed the money, we started the process. We just realized that, until we do the onboarding process with the financial service providers, it would take approximately 1 month. And then within that month, our invoice is already paid. So the financing issue when we need the money is solved, because our buyer would pay the invoice anyway. So I think this is something that you as companies need to understand, that if you can make the onboarding process shorter, and invoice data can help you make the onboarding process shorter, then you can actually extend your SME customer base, because all the companies that cannot think for long term, then they can also get into the factoring process as well. The good news is that we also try to think earlier. So we actually started 2 application processes, and you will see what is the application process or onboarding process practice in Hungary. So we applied for a bank factoring and also for an independent factoring process. And what we have seen in this factoring process, that we need to fill in separate forms. So we need to provide the application form, we need to provide separate customer data sheets, we need to provide general ledgers, we need to provide up-to-date information, and we need to provide additional documents related to the company, but also to customer analytics and payment history of the buyer for each customer that is to be financed separately. We also need to provide bank transaction history information on paper from third-party banks. If we have multiple bank accounts, we need to provide statements to avoid double financing. And finally, when we get to the financing of the invoice, we need to submit the invoices and the invoice data. So that is how the onboarding and financing process looks like, at least in Hungary at the moment. If you have already a better and more streamlined process, then also please type it into the chat. What I did here, so what you can see in bold, is that I bolded those elements of the process which we think that can be either fueled by invoice data or third-party data sources. So you can see that there is substantial improvement potential if you start using structured data and third-party data sources. But let's continue our onboarding journey. So let's look into the application form and the customer data sheet. So if you can go through again the contents of the application form and the data sheets, you can see the same principle here. I bolded those elements or those parts of the application form and customer data sheet, which can be fueled by invoice data or digitalized by invoice data. You can see that the customer information, the effect on the business on losing customers, the supplier information, the effect on the business on losing suppliers, the export-import exposure, the FX exposure, for example, in the application form. These are all things that if you have access to the structured invoice data, then these can be digitalized and automatized. If we are going to the customer data sheets, then you can also see that the invoice data has a lot of the information that is required for the buyer verification or buyer relationship verification of a company. So for example, the buyer details, if you have the mass of invoice data and the history of the invoices, and not in only individual invoice data, but access to a history of invoice data of the company, then you can even judge or have information about the start of the customer relationship. Or if you go back, beyond 3 years, then you don't actually need the start of the customer relationship because it's already ongoing. And you can see that, have you invoiced the customer in the last year, then it will be evident, the payment deadline, the number of invoices, the expected monthly turnover. So it won't be like an expected monthly turnover, but you can actually judge from the history what would be the expected monthly turnover if there is a pattern. You can also have access to the information of the deductions and withholdings. You can also see if you have both the customer invoice data and the supplier invoice data. You can also see whether the buyer is also a supplier. And you can see that what is the payment pattern of the buyer. So, these are things that if you have invoice data, you have basically everything, not everything, but a lot of things in your financing process. So yes, so what is the problem with the current onboarding process? As I mentioned to you, even just filling out the form. So we are talking about SMEs who don't have time. They are not even, financially very educated, but the application process completion can be measured in half a day or at least days, just to put together the data, filling in the data. Obviously, it would require manual data inputs and manual calculations from the SME side. We need to ask about the information about the accountant because we ourselves don't have the information about the general ledger and the buyer and payment and buyer and the supplier data, what is asked from us. And also, I found that we need to fill in redundant information forms. With the digitalization, this can also be eliminated. If separate bank information is required from the company, then we need to go to the bank branch at least twice. So you need to submit the bank information request, and then you need to go and fetch it on paper. So this would take like at least 2 days from a small business owner, which is, I would say, very valuable time for us. And if we don't have to spend time on going to the bank branch, then the SME owner can do something else. So this is the current process, and I think this is a big hurdle for companies, for small companies, to even start and consider factoring, even if it's a great product and it's suitable for each SME who has buyers. So this is the current process. And what would be, my dream process, and what is enabled by invoice data? And I would like to stress that invoice data and third-party data sources, because invoice data is obviously not enough. It can solve like 80% of the problems, but other data sources like company registry data, tax authority data, can also enhance the digitalization of the process. So what would be the dream process is that, I issue the new invoice. As Olena always says, she doesn't need the invoice, the factoring or the financing at 9 a.m. in the morning, but whenever she issues the invoice. So when I issue the invoice, my bank could ask, or financial service provider could ask that, do you need 80% of the invoice amount today? And obviously I would say, yes, I need it. And then getting data from third-party data sources can already be collected and aggregated by the service provider, and I would just need to say yes. So review and agree if everything is fine, then we can go on. And then the factoring company can also ask us to allow us to have access to our invoice data sets. and then also get a consent to get access to the open banking data, and then other questions if they need to be asked regarding the buyer-customer relationship. So those things which cannot be handled with structured data can also be asked. And then finally, the invoicing offer can arrive, and then even the buyer can be notified about the factoring of the invoice. So this is my dream process, and just click, 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 ready. And this can be largely enabled with invoice data. But how can it be done, and why it can be done? I'm sorry if someone has seen this slide already once or multiple times, but I really need to say this or explain this every time, because if you have invoice data, and if you understand the essence of invoice data, then you will understand everything about what is possible with invoice data. So if we are taking a purchase to pay or order to cash process, if we look at it not from an activity perspective, but from a data perspective, then you can see that the invoice data is the largest and deepest data set in the process. So the invoice data has almost everything that is necessary for invoice financing. Obviously, for the financing, you need also the contract data and the proof of delivery, but then the proof of delivery can also be digitalized if you have the invoice data in a structured way already. So in the structured invoice data, you will have the entity data, you will have the item data, you will have the order data, or you can have the order data like PO numbers and so on. You will have the payment means, payment terms. You will have obviously the accounting and tax information, which is not that relevant here, but you have everything about in terms of information about the business transaction that you can use for invoice financing. So that is why invoice data is so useful. And if you have the invoice data, you will have everything. What is also important, that invoice data can best be used if it is structured and standardized. And that is where the invoicing regulations come into place. So if a country introduces a regulation for invoicing, then it will set a standard in which data structure the invoices must be issued, or what is if in case of continuous transaction controls, what is the data that must be submitted to the tax authority. And in most of the cases, like 80% of the information that is required for financing is included already in these standards. But if not, then those missing data pieces can be added manually. But 80% is actually 80% more than the zero. So you are anyway better off with some structured data than no structured data at all. And yes, so this is the how an e-invoice looks like today. There is the PDF version, let's say, or there is an invoice image, which is human readable, but there is also a part which is the structured data part and the machine readable. So, this coded text makes it all possible to manage and process the invoice data automatically or in a digital way. So that is why the whole thing is possible. And a question arises, okay, fine, we have invoice data, but and we have the invoice data regulation, but how can we get access to the invoice data if we are not issuing the invoices ourselves? And naturally, then this is all in our system. So an e-invoice, a true e-invoice, always has the data embedded in the invoice. So if I upload an electronic invoice into a system, then the PDF is available, but also the data content is available so that it can be processed automatically. There are various e-invoice data formats. Customary thing is that when you have the hybrid invoice data format, which is the one which I showed you before, where the PDF also contains the data embedded into the invoice, so they move together. But in some cases, they don't even, so the invoice image is not even required, only the data is sent. It can be chosen what is the standard for a specific country. However, what is necessary for the financing process from a system perspective, that is the invoice data. So that can be, I can get an invoice, I don't care where it is coming from, I can upload it from my computer and it can be processed by the financing or factoring system. There can be API integrations or with the issuing system. So if there are widespread online invoicing services, then the factoring company can establish data connections with these large service providers. So the data can move from the issuing system to the financing system. And finally, a third-party data source can be tax authorities or so-called account aggregators. When you can get access to certain data if you use the service of an account aggregator. Such a scheme is set up in India. So in India, through account aggregators, financial companies or financial institutions can get access to the bank data, they can get access to the tax data, they can get access to the open banking data. So everything basically can be accessed through a couple of APIs. So that is something that I would expect that would come up in the coming years, not only India, but in other countries too. Another issue is how you can ensure that the invoice is authentic and it is not fake. For this question, there can be also multiple answers. So if in different countries, the tax authorities introduce different regulations for invoicing, there are certain countries that have a so-called clearance scheme. This means that even before the invoice is legally issued, the tax authority checks it and says yes, so this invoice can be issued. This is called a clearance system. So then, if once the tax authority says that, this invoice can be issued, and then it is issued by the supplier, then from a financial perspective, there can be no questions about the authenticity of the invoice. There can be still questions about the contents of the invoice and the underlying business transaction, but not the invoice document itself. Some tax authorities do not the same, but they assign an invoice reference number or a hash code about the receipt of the invoice data. So this can also be used as a unique invoice identifier, about which I will talk a little bit later. But if the tax authority sees the invoice data and either approves it or at least acknowledges getting it, then it's like 95-98% of the problem of the authenticity is solved. In other jurisdictions or in other countries, the e-invoices must have an e-signature, and these e-signature are provided by licensed actor, and the e-signature ensures that once an e-signature and a timestamp is put on the invoice, then it can be checked whether the content of the invoice has been changed since its creation or not. So this is also a safe way. The e-invoice check can also be introduced to do the validation of the invoice, and or there in e-invoicing there is always a unique invoice identifier assigned to an invoice. So there cannot be two invoices in one company, in one system at least, which has the same identifier. So this also is a way to check whether this invoice is authentic or not. I was talking about the additional sources. So invoice data is great, but obviously if you have more structured data, it is also the better. So what are these additional data sources? This can be company registries or company data sources. And then these also can be checked. So the supplier data, the buyer data, the verifying the existence of the supplier and the buyer, the tax numbers can also be checked from these data sources. I already mentioned the account aggregators and open banking providers or other financing platforms to provide these additional data sources. And if we are talking about information for approving the payout or the payment of the invoice and the certificate of delivery or proof of delivery, then in certain cases the factoring company can even have a connection with large buyer systems, so that the fact of or acceptance of delivery can also be automated with these data connections. So if you have all these data sources, then all your or the whole of the financing process can be digitalized. This slide is connected to the previous slide. So what kind of validations and checks can be carried out with the use of data, either invoice data or third-party invoice data sources? So the company level information, the invoice level information, and the delivery acceptance by the customer can also be checked through automatized and digitalized processes. Now I would like to just show you a short example, in a demo example, how the processing of invoice data looks like in practice. I will show a different screen so that I can click on the link. So yes, so this will be an upload. This will be an upload of an invoice and getting information from the tax authority. In Hungary, we have a service, an API service provided by the tax authority, which provides supplier and buyer invoice data regarding the business transactions of a company, even if the invoice was not issued from a true electronic format, but because we have a system which is not a clearance system, but a continuous transaction system. Not actually the invoices must be submitted, but certain invoice data must be submitted to the tax authority, but they provide you back this invoice data. So what will happen now that I will upload a PDF, simple PDF invoice, and then in this system, you can categorize the invoice, and by providing the supplier name, and you can see that, by providing the supplier name, the supplier details are already provided, because this system is connected to a company registry. And then when you go to the invoice details, if you provide the invoice data number, then by providing it and pushing the button, you will see that the invoice data is pre-filled automatically. In Hungary, the payment means and payment deadline is not a mandatory field, so that must be put into additionally. But other than that, all invoice data is pre-filled. Yes, and the bank account data is not compulsory either. But by providing this, you can see that the invoice can be processed automatically. If also the payment dates and payment means is a mandatory data field, then the whole invoice can be processed automatically. You can now see that the invoice will be recorded in the system automatically. So you can see that Enigma Web Technology invoice from here. So this is how easy it can become processing an invoice. You can see that this is also time saving on the on the SME side, but what is manual on the input side will be largely manual on the financial service provider side. So if an invoice is provided in an electronic format, then both sides win a great deal. Just a summary, if we go through an invoicing process, what are the points where invoice data can add value to the process? So first of all, the access to the invoice data. So as I mentioned, the invoice data is available in this case in a structured data format. The data sources can be other invoicing solutions, and the data can be retrieved through API connections. Also, custom ERP data structures can be processed with file upload or secure data transfer. So the important thing is that you have access to the structured invoice data somehow. And if you have the invoice data in a structured way, then the financing request can be generated from the invoice data, and this will enable a functionality that, for example, if I issue an invoice from my invoicing systems and there is a button that, okay, do you want to finance this invoice? Do you want to have the 80% of the invoice today? Then I can do it. And this is the point where the sales process or the factoring sales process is not a sales process, but it's like a contextual, or when it is not in the financing application, but let's say in an accounting software, then it will be an embedded financing process, and it can be done when the invoice is issued, or when I check my receivables and I realize that I need some more money for next week. I can click on the invoices that are still not paid, that I want these invoices to be financed today so I can have the money to pay out my employees or my taxes, which is the case in small companies' lives. Next thing is, yes, the verification and the approval. Several, as I described, the validations can be cross-checked within the invoices and throughout the invoice data sets, but also with the third-party data sources, which can be the registry data, tax authority data, e-signatures, and also you can cross-check the invoices with the PO numbers if you are connected to a buyer system. Then, based on this data, an invoice, so the financing contract, if it is needed, can also be generated. And there can be also templates generated for framework agreements. But what is also important that pricing models can be refined and affected by having access to the invoice data, because you can not only see the invoices and the supplier and the buyer, but you can see a track record of the whole customer relationship between the counterparties. And finally, the payout can also be not changed, but digitalized, because the invoice can have a status for status change that it is already financed, and then this data can be exchanged either with the third-party platforms specializing, or certain mechanisms can be established through for data exchange between or among different service providers, how they can check that an invoice is already financed or not. And if you have the whole invoice data assets, then you can put again a flag for the payout, how much has been paid out, when it was paid out, but also for the payback. So this can also be digitalized by using the invoice data and the bank open banking data as well. I won't go through these. If you will watch or rewatch the webinar, then you will find that these are just examples for invoice validations, what can be the criteria for judging the authenticity of the invoice. This is an example from India. And this is also an example from India, how, what these are from the standard operating procedures of the Indian tax authority, how they judge whether if an invoice is real or fake. And a short summary. So how invoice data can accelerate factoring. It can accelerate the onboarding process, because you can see that from the separate onboarding process that SMEs need to go through today. The onboarding process can be an integrated or no onboarding process, because if you have the existing customer, then you will have data about that customer, so you don't need to ask for the data twice. You can also have access to the open banking data and previous invoice data sets of the customer. So the whole thing can be digitalized, data-based instead of a paper-based process, and it can be an event-based or contextual or embedded onboarding process, because you will be there when the invoice is issued. You will have information that an invoice has been issued, and the SME might need the money today. With regards to the individual financing transaction, as I explained, the access to the invoice data allows automated processing, automated validations and check, and the risk models and pricing can also, if you have not just certain data points, but a whole set of invoice data, then you can even introduce differentiated pricing models for different customers even, and you can actually rate the relationship risk instead of a counterparty risk. And this is not my idea, but the credit for this goes to Eva Degenhardt. So I would like to mention her name because she mentioned it in a discussion last week. But I think it is very useful to mention this. So this is kind of a short summary what we think how invoice data can help making the invoice financing process smoother and more seamless for for both service providers and SMEs. And we would like to hear your questions and views.
Thank
If you
you
have
very
any,
much.
please
Yeah.
have questions and please have views.
Yes, we do have. Well, first of all, thank you, Katalin, as usual, a great presentation, a very detailed one. And just wanted to mention that I have a next dream process for factoring already, because the one that you mentioned, we do see some examples actually from the last year, for example, here in Poland, especially in Poland, I would say like this, is with the digital invoice finance or factoring process, when you upload the invoice, and then of course there is no data in kind of XML or some other format, so that the invoice data are kind of scanned by the OCR, and me as a customer should check it and like click it whether it is right, correct or not. Send it. I mean, this onboarding, if it is digital, right, it takes kind of, I don't know, a minute maybe. And if this is a micro factoring or micro invoice finance, you receive a decision really in minutes. But then this part of the check-in with the counterparty is becoming, can take longer than you think, especially if this is an export invoice, because for the domestic invoices and counterparties, I think this process will really be, I don't know, in seconds, I guess, with the implementation of invoicing. It's coming in Poland next year, like should be 1st of July, if not, will be not rescheduled again. But yes, so how do you see this with the how this can help with these export invoices if, for example, the counterparty is in the country which is not in the mandatory e-invoicing scheme at the moment?
Yes. So in this case, there are various things. So if it's a big buyer, then integrations with the big buyer system can happen, and then it can be automated. However, it is highly unlikely. Another case can be if we have like SME platforms that do not only operate in one country, but in several countries, then the buyer can be maybe notified through that platform, or it doesn't need to be actually to do in a have a multiple, how we say, have a multi-country operation, but the buyer can be notified via email that we got this financing request, do you approve? So that can also be a solution for that. So if you provide the contact details of the buyer, then an email approval or approval request can be done, or even they can be like onboarded into the platform so that they also log in and click yes, I approve. So there are technical opportunities and possibilities here. It is not so the technology is not the bottleneck in this, but more like the onboarding process and the education process, how you onboard buyers and suppliers into the process. But I think it can be solved with the right marketing assets and incentives. So even information can be put on the invoice information can be put into the email when you send out the invoice. So various things, can be found out for this. But yeah, so there are things that take time, that take time, and this will be one of the things that needs to be solved until global interoperability is there and everyone has at least their own invoicing schemes, which can be, mapped into each other. But yeah, but
Yeah.
if you solve the domestic problem, then you solve 80% of the problem.
Correct.
Let's say
Yes.
that.
Yes, we have a question from Kasia. Thank you for that. Amazing presentation. Thank you very much. How do you see the payment collection from the buyer without changing their bank accounts so that the client does not get paid twice? Actually, we don't change in digital invoicing. It's just the information goes to the buyer.
Yes. So if the bank, I mean the how you say the bank account data is there on the invoice and the payment gets there, but it's more like I think open banking is the solution for this, or can be a solution for this, if I understand the question correctly, because to some account the money will arrive and you will see that if the money has already arrived to one of the accounts of the supplier. If this was not the answer to the question, let's discuss
I mean,
separately
the
more in
question
detail.
is that, well, now, for example, when I, as an SME customer, issue the invoice, so I
Yes.
treat for the seller's details, so stating the seller's detail and my details, right, and the my banking accounts, and then when I sell it to the invoice finance or factoring, I do not change these details so that the buyer, if I get the finance, if I get this 80% of the invoice finance, then the buyer should pay to the factoring company and not to me.
Yes.
So this is but technically, I mean, now we don't change these things. I think this is a manually done job at the moment. I don't know how it can be automated.
Yeah, I think the best would be to discuss the question separately. So, what exactly the question, so that we can answer the right question, because I'm not sure about the question itself.
All right.
If you don't mind, Kasia, then let's discuss separately.
What is? Let's sure. Yes, let's probably wrap up, because I mean we can have some extra moment if we have questions. But what would you suggest now to the factors, to both of the like a group of factors, I would say, so the ones that, for example, have access to the invoice data even now at the moment, if, for example, they in the group offer the invoicing or accounting products in the packages or in the ecosystem for their SME or business customers, and the ones that does not such an access to internally to the invoice data, but if they would like, I mean, to use it, they should receive the access to the external sources of the invoice data. What are your tips and recommendations now in terms of coming when that
So, yeah.
invoice?
So if you have access already to the invoice data because you issue invoices from your system, then please use it. Please use it and start doing the digital factoring process. Start implementing the digital factoring process, because it's like it's the dream of every SME. If you don't have an invoice issuance process in your system, then if there is structured invoice data available from the tax authorities, that is good, and then you can start working with the invoice data. You don't really need any integrations here, because if there is the structured invoice data, the companies simply can upload it by one, and then they can be processed. If there is no e-invoicing scheme in your country, then I would suggest to integrate with the, I don't know, top 3 or 5 big online invoicing providers, because I'm sure that there are already online invoicing providers everywhere. So with top five integrations, you can also have access to the invoice data, and you can introduce this kind of digital financing without any tax regulation. And it's a good point to get access to the customer base of those online invoicing service providers. So I would consider that. And what I heard in Hungary, that there are also the factoring software providers. So it might not be you who has to do this, but the factoring software provider companies can do the work for you. In Hungary, the factoring software company already established the data connection with the tax authorities, so all the users of this software can have access to this functionality. So you might want to convince your factoring software provider to do the work instead of you.
Yes, and also I would probably mention and stress here that on the final slide that you showed, that invoice finance or factoring should move to this embedded or event-based actually finance. So when the customer issues the invoice, this is this event when the customer might need this type of finance, and this button right after you issue the invoice, finance this invoice. I think this is the tool, the very right tool to sell factoring and invoice finance to the SME customers. So as Katalin, yes, you mentioned and I mentioned it previously, that being an SME customer and somebody calling me 9 a.m. and asking whether I need factoring. No, 9 a.m. I don't need, because I'm thinking on the other things. I might need coffee. I might think on some business situation. But when I do need the factoring is the moment when I issue the invoices. And the next level dream is when, and I hope this will be implemented some days in all the main part of the banks, the prediction of the customer behavior, and it is possible with the implementation, for example, BFM solutions with the cash flow projections, because as you, Katalin, mentioned, and as I think all of you know, that SME will not do forecasts by themselves because of 2 reasons. They don't have time and they do not have knowledge. But knowing even by myself, even I'm having knowledge, and I've created some back then.
Same here. I'm doing the Excel sheets, but you don't have the time to do it.
Any time see and forecast my payments and my income. So I would need is a prediction and push to my mobile application that, hey, tomorrow you have to pay this and that. You don't have enough money, or you don't have enough balance on your current account.
Or you won't have in 2 weeks when you need to pay the taxes. You need to pay in 2 weeks, and you need to pay today.
Want to finance invoices and get this and this amount? Yes, no, click, and this is the finance should be offered to SMEs with a very quick and simple way. And I think invoicing gives such an opportunity. So we do hope to see some innovations coming connected with that the next years. So we will update.
If you remember one thing, then one thing should be invoicing is coming. Please think how you can use invoice data in your operations.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Katalin, first of all, for great presentations and comments. Thank you very much, our attendees, and your comments and questions as well. Gardana, Kasia, Andreas, thank you very much. Thank you for staying till the very end, and see you next time online. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye bye.